Think about it. We experience the world through our senses. Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. I mean, they're how we understand reality, right?
Fundamentally, yes.
But what happens when these senses, the ones we rely on so much, actually give us a skewed picture?
Yeah. That's the fascinating territory we're exploring today. Sensory illusions.
Sensory illusions, okay.
Exactly. This deep dive is all about unpacking the psychology behind those moments, those intriguing times when our perception doesn't quite line up with the physical world.
Right.
We're going to look at why these illusions happen and, importantly, what they tell us about the pretty remarkable way our brains build our experience.
So these aren't just random mistakes our brain makes, flukes.
No, not at all. Sensory illusions are actually systematic misinterpretations, and they happen when there's real sensory input.
Okay, so something is actually there.
Precisely. There's a real stimulus, but our brain processes it in a predictable way that just leads to an inaccurate perception. That predictability, that consistency, that's what makes them so incredibly valuable for scientific study.
Okay, so my brain isn't just like making stuff up out of thin air.
Exactly. And that's a really key difference between illusions and, say, hallucinations. Hallucinations are perceptions without any external stimulus. Imagine seeing a shadow in a dark room and thinking it's a person.
Yeah.
That's an illusion. You're misinterpreting a real shadow. A hallucination would be seeing that person when there's absolutely nothing there. No shadow, nothing.
Got it.
And while hallucinations can sometimes be normal, they can also point to other underlying issues. Illusions, though, they're really all about how we interpret sensory data that's already present.
Right, interpreting what's actually coming in. Yeah. So, okay, why should we care about these sensory quirks? I mean, it sounds interesting, sure,
yeah.
But what's the real significance?
Oh, their importance goes way beyond just being amusing or curious. Illusions give us these profound insights into how our minds actually work. They aren't just entertaining little tricks. They're essential tools for understanding human cognition, brain function, the actual mechanisms of perception, even neurological conditions.
Wow.
Yeah, they offer this unique window into how our perceptual systems process and interpret information. They shed light on fundamental cognitive processes, attention, memory, even things like consciousness and perceptual development.
That definitely reframes it. So, okay, what's the sort of core idea we should hold on to as we get deeper into this?
I think the central theme is that perception isn't passive. It's not like our brain is just a camera recording data.
Yeah.
It's an active, constructive process. Our brains are constantly interpreting, predicting, actively building the reality we experience based on the sensory input they get.
Building reality, I like that.
And illusions. They're prime examples of this active construction. They show us how our brains make sense of the world, often by filling in gaps and making, assumptions.
Okay, so our brains are actively building, not just recording. Makes sense. Tell me more about the nature of these illusions then. Are they all the same kind of thing?
Well, they're systematic products of how our perceptual system is built and how it operates. Many illusions can be understood through principles like the after effects of sensory stimulation, or even overstimulation. After effects, like seeing spots after a camera flash.
Exactly like that. And think about our sensitivity to stimuli. It operates within certain thresholds, right? There's an absolute threshold, the minimum needed to detect something, and a difference threshold, the minimum change needed to notice a difference. These thresholds aren't fixed, they fluctuate. And those fluctuations can influence our later perceptions, sometimes leading us to misjudge things.
Like if you lift something heavy, then something light feels even lighter.
Precisely. That kind of contract effect. Gestalt psychology even talked about a fading trace, basically. Lingering neural activity from one sensation influencing the next one.
A fading trace. Yeah, and this trace might fade faster or slower in different people. It could help explain why some individuals are more susceptible to certain illusions than others. Maybe people who are more influenced by the overall context, field-dependent thinkers, might show weaker after effects compared to those who focus more on individual parts.
Interesting. So how I generally process information, my cognitive style, could affect whether I get fooled by an illusion.
Exactly. And it's not just about the raw sensory input either. Higher level stuff, our cognitive processes like emotions, memories, associations, and especially our expectations, they all play a big role in creating these illusional misperceptions.
The top-down influence.
That's it. Top-down processing our existing knowledge and beliefs, shaping how we interpret what our senses are telling us from the bottom up.
So top-down and bottom-up are working together, or maybe sometimes conflicting, and that creates these odd results. You mentioned different types of illusions earlier. Can we break that down?
Yeah, a really useful way to categorize them comes from Richard Gregory. He classified them into three main types: optical, sensory, and perceptual illusions.
Okay, optical, sensory, perceptual. What's the difference?
So optical illusions involve a physical distortion of the light before it even reaches your eye.
Before it gets to me? Like what?
Think of that classic bent straw in a glass of water. The light rays are actually bending as they pass from water to air, or mirages on a hot road. The error, so to speak, is in the physical stimulus itself. It's explained by physics.
Okay, so the light's already playing tricks before my eye even sees it. Got it. What about sensory illusions then?
Sensory illusions happen when our sense organs themselves, the eyes, ears, skin, are somehow, let's say, upset or transmit misleading information.
How so?
Well, after staring at a bright light, or a perfect example, or that weird feeling of movement after you've been watching a waterfall for a while, the waterfall effect, even just gently pressing on your eyeball can create flashes of light, right? Phosphenes. In these cases, the sense organ itself is generating a signal that isn't quite accurate or veridical. It's really about the physiology of our senses.
Okay, so the hardware, the sense organ, is acting up a bit or being stimulated weirdly, and that leaves perceptual illusions.
Exactly. Perceptual illusions are where the misinterpretation happens in the brain, even if the sensory input coming from the eyes or ears is relatively accurate.
So the data's okay, but the processing is creative.
You could put it that way. The Necker cube is the classic example here. That simple line drawing of a cube that seems to flit back and forth.
Yeah, I can never decide which way it's facing.
Right. The drawing isn't changing, but your brain is actively alternating between two equally plausible 3D interpretations. These illusions are all about how the brain processes, organizes, and makes sense of the sensory data. This is really the domain of cognitive psychology and neuroscience.
Okay, so optical is physics, sensory is physiology, and perceptual is the brain's interpretation. Makes sense. So to understand an illusion, we need to figure out where the misleading part happened.
Precisely. At which stage?
Let's explore some of these then. What are some classic examples, especially the visual ones? You said they're the most studied.
They are. And keep in mind, our brain is always integrating information from multiple senses. But visual illusions are often fantastic demonstrations of how we interpret 3D space from the 2D images that hit our retinas.
Okay, hit me with some visual trickery.
All right, first up, the Mueller-Lyer illusion. You've probably seen it. Two lines, same exact length. One has arrowheads pointing inwards, the other outwards.
And the one with the outward fins always looks longer. Always.
Right, almost universally. The prevailing theory, though debated, links this to misapplied depth cues. The outward fins resemble the far corner of a room, which we perceive as further away. So our brain thinks, if it's further away but takes up the same space on my retina, it must be physically larger. It applies size constancy scaling inappropriately.
Because it looks like a far corner, even on a flat piece of paper.
Wow. And you mentioned culture can affect this.
Yes, there's classic research suggesting people from cultures with less exposure to carpentered environments, with lots of straight lines and corners, might be less susceptible, though the strength and interpretation of that cultural effect are still discussed.
Fascinating. What's next?
How about the Ponzo illusion? Again, two identical horizontal lines, but they're placed between converging diagonal lines, like railway tracks receding into the distance.
And the top line looks longer.
Yep, because your brain interprets the converging lines as linear perspective, a powerful depth cue. It assumes the top line is further away, just like with Mueller-Lyer, and scales up its perceived size. It beautifully shows how our brain imposes 3D rules onto 2D images.
So my real-world experience with perspective totally shapes how I see that simple drawing.
It seems to, yes. Then there's the Ebbinghaus illusion, also known as Titchener circles. You have a central circle. If it's surrounded by small circles, it looks bigger than an identical central circle surrounded by large circles. Ah, right. The neighbors change how big it looks.
Exactly. It's a powerful demonstration of how local context and relative comparisons dominate our size perception. What's around something changes how we see it.
Context is king there. Okay, back to the Necker cube. You said it flips. What does that flipping tell us?
That flipping, that biciple perception, it vividly shows our brain isn't passive. It actively tries to impose structure on ambiguous 2D information. It finds two good 3D interpretations and just oscillates between them because the input doesn't favor one over the other definitively.
My brain just can't settle on one answer. Okay, what about illusions involving movement or color? anything dynamic.
Oh, definitely. The lilac chaser illusion is a great one. You see a circle of lilac-colored dots disappearing one by one,
Yeah.
and often you'll start to perceive a green dot moving around the circle in the gap. Sometimes the lilac dots might even seem to disappear completely, leaving only the moving green dot.
Wait, a green dot appears. Where does that come from?
It's a negative afterimage. Stare at lilac, a shade of magenta, then look away or shift focus, and your color receptors that were processing lilac become fatigued, so you see the complementary color, which is green. The illusion combines this with apparent motion. The brain fills in the movement between the disappearing dots.
So my brain is actively inventing a green dot and
Yeah.
making it move. That's wild. Okay, what about brightness and color tricks?
Lots of those. Simultaneous contrast is a big one. The brightness or color of a background drastically affects how we perceive the brightness or color of an object on top of it.
Like a gray square looking lighter on a black background than on a white one.
Exactly. And successive contrast gives us those after images we just talked about. Stare at red, then look at a white wall and you see cyan green.
Right.
And then there's Adelson's checker shadow illusion. This one is amazing. You see a checkerboard with a shadow cast over part of it. Two squares, one in the shadow, one out, look like completely different shades of gray, one light, one dark.
Yeah, I know that one.
But they are physically the exact same shade of gray, identical luminance. Your brain automatically compensates for the perceived shadow. It thinks, okay, this square is in shadow, but it looks this bright, so it must be intrinsically a very light square. It's a failure of brightness constancy because the shadow cue is so strong.
That checkerboard still blows my mind. It's so convincing. Are there other kinds of visual illusions we should quickly mention?
Oh, tons. There are things like metamorphopsias, where shapes look distorted, micropsia and macropsy, where things look unusually small or large, polyopia, seeing multiple images, palinopsia, seeing after images that persist or recur, achromatopsia, problems with color vision, the Pulfrich phenomenon, where motion can look like it's happening in depth. The list goes on.
A whole world of visual weirdness. Okay, let's shift senses. What about auditory illusions? Does our hearing get tricked in similar ways?
It absolutely does. And these illusions reveal that hearing, just like seeing, isn't just passive reception. It's an active interpretive process.
Give me an example.
The classic is the McGurk effect. This one really highlights multisensory integration. So you watch a video of someone saying, for example, the syllable ga,
Okay.
but the audio track plays the syllable ba.
So my eyes see ga, my ears hear ba.
Right. And what do most people perceive? They often report hearing da or tha, a completely different sound that's sort of a blend or compromise between the visual and auditory information.
Whoa. So my eyes can literally change what I hear.
In this context, yes. It powerfully shows how dominant vision can be, especially for speech perception, and how our brain fights to create a single, coherent, multisensory reality. It forces a fusion.
That's incredible. What else?
How about the shepherd tone? This is an auditory illusion where you hear a sound that seems to be continuously rising or continuously falling in pitch, but it never actually gets higher or lower overall. It just seems to go on forever.
I think I've heard that in movies. It creates this real sense of tension. How does it work?
It's clever. It's constructed using multiple sine waves layered an octave apart. As the tones sweep upwards in pitch, the highest pitched tone fades out and a new low-pitched tone fades in at the bottom. Your brain can't quite resolve this complex structure and gets locked onto the rising quality, creating the illusion of perpetual ascent.
That never-ending staircase of sound. Very unsettling. Okay, what about hearing things that aren't strictly there, like mishearing lyrics?
That relates to things like phantom words. This happens when we listen to ambiguous or repetitive sounds like noise or certain types of music loops. Our brain, always trying to find meaning and patterns, might latch on to words or phrases that aren't actually in the sound signal.
Like hearing voices in static.
Exactly. And what you think you hear is heavily influenced by your expectations, your current thoughts, your native language, even your emotional state. It really shows our brain's powerful drive to impose meaning, even onto noise.
Like thinking you hear your name called in a noisy room when no one did.
That's a very common example, yeah. Okay,
Right.
should we move on to touch? Tactile illusions.
Yeah, let's do it. How can touch be fooled?
Tactile illusions really reveal how our brain constructs our sense of body awareness and interprets signals from our skin. The most famous and perhaps profound is phantom limb sensation.
Right, feeling a limb that's been amputated.
Exactly. Individuals who've lost a limb often continue to feel vivid sensations, touch, pressure, temperature, movement, even intense pain, as if the limb were still there. It's thought to reflect the persistent activity and representation of that limb in the brain's somatosensory cortex. The map is still there, even if the territory is gone.
That's such a powerful, kind of haunting example of the brain's internal representation. What other tactile tricks are there?
There's the cutaneous rabbit illusion, sometimes called sensory saltation. Imagine you get a couple of quick taps on your wrist and then a couple more near your elbow.
Yeah,
You might perceive those taps not just at the wrist and elbow, but as a series of discrete hops traveling up your arm, even though the skin in between was never actually touched. Your brain sort of fills in the gaps to create a plausible sense of movement.
It connects the dots, literally.
Pretty much. Then there's Aristotle's illusion. A really simple one you can try. Cross your index and middle fingers.
Okay, crossed.
Now touch a single small object, like the tip of a pen or even your nose, with the tips of both crossed fingers simultaneously.
Whoa. Feels like I'm touching two separate things.
Right. Because your brain isn't used to those two skin surfaces, which are normally far apart, being stimulated by the same object simultaneously. It interprets the unusual pattern based on prior experience and concludes there must be two objects.
That cross finger thing still gets me every time. Anything else with touch?
Let's see. There's the phantom motion illusion. If you have two stationary points on your skin vibrating, under certain conditions of distance and timing, you can feel like a single point is moving back and forth between them.
Like the rabbit, but with vibration.
Sort of analogous, yeah. And the thermal grill illusion is quite striking. If you touch a surface made of alternating warm and cool bars, neither hot nor cold enough to cause pain on their own, the combined sensation can be surprisingly, sometimes painfully, hot. It suggests our temperature sensing pathways interact in complex ways.
Wow, warm plus cool equals burning hot. That's counterintuitive. Okay, it's amazing how easily touch can be misled. What about the chemical senses, smell and taste?
Right. Olfactory illusions, smell, often involve adaptation. You know, olfactory fatigue, right? You walk into a bakery, smell the amazing bread, but after a few minutes, you barely notice it anymore unless the smell changes.
Yeah, you get used to it.
That's adaptation. Context also plays a huge role. Think about flavor. Most of what we call taste is actually smell. Specifically, aromas reaching our olfactory receptors from inside our mouth, that's retronasal olfaction. We perceive it as happening on the tongue, but it's mostly smell.
So the smell feels like taste.
Largely, yes. And visual cues can set up olfactory expectations. Seeing red-colored candy might make you expect or even perceive a cherry or strawberry smell more strongly. We should also distinguish illusions like distorted smells, parosmia, from smell hallucinations, phantasmia, where you smell something that isn't there at all.
Okay, so expectations and context are big for smell. What about gustatory illusions, taste itself?
Taste is heavily influenced by other senses, especially smell, as we just said. Flavor is fundamentally multisensory.
So not just the tongue.
Definitely not. The color of food or drink is a huge factor. A pink-colored drink might be perceived as sweeter than the same drink-colored green. Red-dyed white wine can fool even experienced tasters into perceiving aromas typical of red wine.
Just the color changes the perceived taste.
It can significantly influence it. And smell, as we mentioned, is dominant. If you block your nose, the complexity of flavors plummets. You can still taste sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, but you lose all the nuances.
Right. Food tastes bland when you have a cold.
Exactly. Even texture influences taste perception. A rougher texture might enhance perceived sourness, while creaminess is strongly linked to perceived richness. And of course, our expectations, if you believe something will taste good or bad, that can genuinely shape how you perceive its taste.
It really sounds like all our senses are constantly talking to each other, influencing each other.
Absolutely. And that brings us nicely to crossmodal illusions, where input to one sense directly alters perception in another.
We already had McGurk, visual influencing auditory.
Right. Another example is the flash beep illusion. If you see a single brief flash of light, but at the same time you hear two quick beeps, you might perceive two flashes of light to match the beeps. This suggests that, at least for timing information, our auditory sense can sometimes dominate or capture our visual sense. Auditory temporal dominance.
Hearing changes what I see.
Okay. And then there's the famous rubber hand illusion. This one's fascinating for body ownership. Your real hand is hidden from view, maybe under a table. A realistic rubber hand is placed in front of you where your hand might be. Okay. Then, someone strokes both your hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand simultaneously and synchronously with brushes.
Stroking both at the same time.
Yes. After a short while, many people start to feel the sensation of touch as if it's coming from the rubber hand. They might even feel like the rubber hand is their own hand.
Whoa.
And if you measure where they feel their hidden hand is located, proprioception, it often drifts towards the rubber hand. It's a powerful illusion showing the interplay of vision, touch, and proprioception in creating our sense of bodily self.
That rubber hand illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that my sense of my own body is that changeable is kind of mind-bending.
It truly demonstrates how the brain works hard to integrate potentially conflicting multisensory information to create a unified, coherent sense of reality. And illusions often pop up right at the seams of that integration process when things get challenging or ambiguous.
Okay, so all these different illusions across all the senses, they must point to some really fundamental ways our brains process information, right? What are the core psychological principles making these happen?
Exactly. Illusions aren't just random errors. They reveal key aspects of how our brain normally functions. We can understand them through several interconnected ideas. The interplay of bottom-up and top-down processing, Gestalt principles of organization, the mechanisms of perceptual constancy, and more recently, the idea of the predictive brain.
Well, let's break those down. We touched on bottom-up and top-down. Can you expand on how they create illusions?
Sure. So bottom-up processing is data-driven. It starts with the raw sensory input from our receptors. Top-down processing is concept-driven. It uses our existing knowledge, beliefs, expectations, and context to interpret that incoming data.
Right.
Illusions often arise from the interaction or sometimes the conflict between these two streams. Top-down expectations can powerfully shape or even distort our interpretation of the bottom-up signals, especially when the input is ambiguous. Think of seeing faces in clouds or interpreting an ambiguous ink blot. Your brain imposes meaning based on experience.
So what I expect to see or want to see can actually change what I perceive from the raw data.
Okay.
What about Gestalt principles?
The Gestalt psychologists working in the early 20th century emphasized that our brain doesn't just see disconnected dots or lines. It actively organizes sensory elements into meaningful wholes or patterns. The idea that the whole is different from the sum of its parts.
Okay.
They describe several principles of perceptual organization, like figure ground perception, seeing objects against a background, like in Rubin's vase illusion, proximity, grouping nearby items, similarity, grouping similar items, continuity, preferring smooth, continuous lines, and closure, filling in gaps to see complete objects.
Like seeing a triangle where there are only disconnected corners of the Knisa triangle.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of closure. Many illusions work by cleverly exploiting these innate organizational tendencies of our brain. The illusion happens because our brain follows its usual organizing rules, even when those rules lead to a non-veridical perception in a specific artificial context.
Our brain's drive for order and completeness can sometimes lead it astray in these specific situations.
Got it. What about perceptual constancy? You mentioned that before. Right. Perceptual constancy refers to our amazing ability to perceive objects as having stable properties, size, shape, color, brightness, even when the sensory information reaching our eyes changes dramatically.
Like knowing a door is still rectangular even as it opens and the shape on my retina changes.
Precisely. Or knowing a person walking away isn't actually shrinking even though their image on your retina gets smaller. Size constancy. Or seeing an apple as red, whether it's in bright sunlight or shade, color constancy. These constancies are crucial for navigating a stable world.
So how do they cause illusions?
Illusions often occur when the mechanisms responsible for maintaining constancy are fooled or misapplied, usually because the stimulus provides misleading cues. We saw this with Muller-Lyer and Ponzo, potentially misapplied size constancy due to misleading depth cues. The checker-shadow illusion is a failure of brightness constancy because the shadow cue overrides the actual luminance information. The moon illusion, why the moon looks huge on the horizon, is likely related to misperceived distance and size constancy too.
So the very mechanisms that usually help us see a stable, predictable world can sometimes backfire when given unusual input. Okay. And the last one you mentioned was the predictive brain.
Yes, this is a more recent and very influential framework. The core idea is that the brain isn't just passively receiving sensory data. Instead, it's constantly predicting the causes of its sensory input based on internal models of the world it has built up through experience.
Predicting, like guessing what's coming next.
Kind of, but more like generating hypotheses about what's out there. Perception, in this view, is a process of matching these top-down predictions against the bottom-up sensory evidence. The goal is to minimize prediction error, the mismatch between what the brain expects and what it actually receives. Some even describe perception as a kind of controlled hallucination.
Controlled hallucination, wow.
Yeah. Illusions, from this perspective, can be seen as instances where the brain's prior beliefs or predictions are particularly strong, or the sensory input is ambiguous, leading the prediction to override or significantly shape the interpretation of the sensory data. The checker shadow illusion fits well here. Our strong prior belief about how shadows affect surface brightness dominates the raw luminance signal. Ambiguous figures like the duck rabbit show the brain flipping between predictions. Even the dress phenomenon might relate to different implicit assumptions or predictions about the lighting conditions.
So illusions basically reveal the brain's predictive models and how strongly our prior beliefs influence what we actually perceive.
Exactly. And it suggests that illusory perception isn't necessarily faulty processing. It's often the normal predictive machinery of the brain encountering stimuli that challenge its assumptions or models.
Okay, so the brain's always making its best guess based on past experience and context. And illusions happen when those guesses, while following the usual rules, don't match reality in specific cases. Now, you hinted earlier that not everyone experiences illusions the same way. Is everyone equally susceptible?
No, definitely not. Susceptibility to illusions varies quite a bit from person to person, and even within the same person, depending on the context. Factors like contextual cues, how much attention you're paying, your age, your cognitive style, your cultural background, and even certain clinical conditions can all influence how strongly you perceive an illusion, or if you perceive it at all.
Okay, let's unpack that. How do things like prior knowledge and attention specifically play a role?
Well, prior knowledge and expectations can dramatically influence illusion perception. A classic example is the Ames room illusion, that distorted room that makes people look tiny or giant. It works because we have a very strong expectation that rooms are rectangular. Our brain holds on to that assumption even when the visual cues contradict it, leading to the size distortion.
So my assumption about rooms overrides the actual visual data.
Pretty much. Context is obviously huge, as we saw with the Ebbinghaus illusion, the surrounding circles, or simultaneous brightness contrast. The immediate environment of a stimulus drastically changes how we perceive it. And attention matters too. How much you're focusing and what you're focusing on can modulate the strength of some illusions, although studying this can be tricky because directing attention is itself a top-down process.
So what I'm paying attention to can literally change the illusion. What about individual differences like age or thinking style?
Yeah, there are definite age effects. Susceptibility to some illusions, like Mueller-Lyer, tends to decrease as children get older, while others, like Ebbinghaus, might increase. Older adults might experience some illusions differently too, perhaps related to changes in processing speed or attentional control. It reflects ongoing cognitive and perceptual development or decline across the lifespan.
Interesting. And cognitive style.
Cognitive style, for example, whether someone tends to process information globally versus locally, or is more influenced by context, field dependent, versus focusing on parts, field independent, has been linked to differences in susceptibility to certain illusions and after effects. People who are more field dependent might experience weaker after effects, but perceive illusions involving motion perspective faster.
So how I generally approach information influences how I see these specific visual tricks. What about clinical conditions? You mentioned that.
Yes, alterations in illusion perception have been observed in various clinical conditions. For instance, some studies suggest individuals with schizophrenia might be less susceptible to certain visual illusions, potentially indicating differences in contextual processing or the balance between top-down and bottom-up influences. People with autism spectrum disorder might also show different patterns of illusion susceptibility, sometimes linked to a tendency towards local processing. Studying these differences can offer valuable insights into the perceptual worlds associated with these conditions.
Wow, so illusions can actually be a window into understanding differences in brain function in these conditions.
Yeah.
What about cultural influences? You mentioned the carpentered world idea for Mueller-Lyer.
Right. This is a fascinating and sometimes controversial area. There's evidence suggesting that susceptibility to certain geometric illusions, like Mueller-Lyer and Ponzo, does vary systematically across cultures.
How so?
The classic explanation for Mueller-Lyer, the carpentered world hypothesis, suggested that people raised in environments rich with straight lines, right angles, and perspective cues, like Western cities, learn perceptual habits that make them more susceptible to illusions based on misapplied depth cues from lines. People from environments with fewer such features were found, in some older studies, to be less susceptible.
So the visual world you grow up in shapes your basic perception.
That was the idea. Similarly, people from rural or non-Western settings sometimes show less susceptibility to the ponzo illusion compared to urban dwellers, possibly due to differing exposure to linear perspective cues like roads and railways receding into the distance. There have even been reported cultural differences in the Ebbinghaus illusion.
So what explains these cultural differences? Is it just the environment?
It's likely complex. Some researchers attribute it partly to the visual environment shaping perceptual learning, while others emphasize differences in culturally influenced attentional biases, for example, a tendency towards more holistic, context-sensitive processing in some East Asian cultures versus more analytic, context-independent processing often associated with Western cultures. Whatever the exact reasons, these cross-cultural findings challenge the idea of universal perception and really underscore the role of experience in shaping how we see.
Culture shaping how I see simple lines. That's still pretty mind-blowing. Okay, so clearly studying illusions gives us a lot more than just, fun party tricks. What's the real deeper significance here?
Yeah, it goes far beyond mere curiosity. Studying sensory illusions offers truly profound insights into the mind and brain.
In what ways?
Firstly, they illuminate normal perceptual processes and brain function. By seeing where the system breaks down or produces non-veridical output, we learned about the rules, assumptions, and shortcuts the brain uses for everyday perception. Illusions expose the seams in our construction of reality.
They show us the rules by showing us when the rules lead to an unexpected result.
Exactly. They demonstrate that perception is active and constructive, interpreting, predicting, filling in. They allow researchers to dissect specific cognitive processes like vision, attention, memory, even consciousness. Secondly, they help us understand cognitive biases and the subjective construction of reality.
How do sensory illusions relate to cognitive biases like confirmation bias or something?
There's a strong analogy. Both sensory illusions and cognitive biases involve systematic deviations from accuracy, one in perception, the other in judgment or decision-making. Both often result from the brain using heuristics, assumptions, and being influenced by context. Sensory illusions can be seen as perceptual analogs of cognitive biases, highlighting that our experience of reality is fundamentally subjective and constructed, not a direct readout of the world.
That's a powerful connection. What about the clinical side?
Huge clinical relevance. We already mentioned altered illusion perception in conditions like schizophrenia and autism, but also think about perceptual distortions that are illusions or related phenomena, misinterpretations, and delirium, mood-congruent perceptual biases in depression or anxiety, and of course the phantom limb phenomenon. Analyzing how patients perceive illusions can potentially aid in detecting abnormalities in brain function or diagnosing certain disorders.
And can illusions be used therapeutically?
Yes, this is a growing area. Mirror therapy for phantom limb pain is a prime example, using a visual illusion, seeing the reflection of the intact limb moving, to modulate the representation of the phantom limb and alleviate pain. Similar body illusions, often using VR or mirrors, are being explored for chronic pain conditions, eating disorders, altering perceived body size, and other psychological conditions.
Using illusions to help people.
Exactly. But there are ethical considerations too, especially with immersive tech like VRR. If we can create powerful illusions, how do we ensure they're used responsibly and not for manipulation? It's also important to remember that altered illusion susceptibility isn't inherently good or bad. Its clinical meaning is nuanced.
Right. And beyond the clinic, any practical applications?
Loads. Think about art and design. Artists like M.C. Escher masterfully exploited optical illusions. Street artists use anamorphosis to create stunning 3D effects. Graphic designers and UI/UX designers constantly use principles of perception related to grouping, color, contrast, things revealed by illusions to guide attention, create hierarchy, and improve usability. Think about how color choices, layout, sound design, even haptic feedback in devices leverage perceptual principles.
Okay, art design, technology.
Big time. Virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR, are all about creating convincing sensory illusions to immerse users in virtual environments for entertainment, education, training, therapy, even marketing. How we design avatars in VR can even influence users' behavior through illusory body ownership. Camouflage in nature and military applications relies heavily on principles of visual illusion, breaking contours, matching backgrounds, and of course, marketing and advertising use perceptual tricks all the time to grab attention, make products look appealing, and influence consumer choices.
So illusions are embedded in art, technology, even how things are sold to us. It's everywhere. Looking back, how did we even get started studying this stuff? Has fascination with illusions always been there?
Oh, the fascination goes way back. You can find examples suggesting awareness of perceptual tricks in ancient Greek and Egyptian art and architecture. Philosophers have long debated the reliability of the senses, but the scientific study really took off in the 19th century.
The golden age, you call it.
Yeah, it became a hot topic in experimental psychology and physiology. There was a shift from just observing natural illusions to creating and studying them systematically in the lab, aided by new technologies like photography and optical instruments like the stereoscope. Early focus was often on depth and motion perception, then later on those abstract geometrical illusions. The term optical illusion itself gained traction then.
What were some key moments or discoveries?
Well, the discovery and naming of illusions like the Necker cube, Louis Necker, 1832, showing spontaneous depth reversal was important. The Muller-Lyer illusion, Franz Muller-Lyer, 1889, became incredibly famous and sparked decades of research, including that cross-cultural work we discuss, Seagal, Campbell, Herskovits in the 1960s. Discoveries by Hering, Mach, Poggendorff, Zollner also led to illusions named after them.
And the big ideas, the theories.
Several major theoretical shifts happened. Hermann von Helmholtz in the mid-19th century proposed that perception involves unconscious inferences, suggesting that many illusions are cognitive, resulting from interpretations based on experience. This contrasts with purely sensory explanations.
Unconscious inferences. Sounds like early predictive processing.
There's definitely a conceptual link. Then came the Gestalt psychologists, Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler, in the early 20th century, emphasizing inherent organizational principles, proximity, similarity, closure, arguing that these principles explain many illusions like figure ground reversals, Rubens vase, or seeing illusory contours, Canisa triangle. They focused on how the whole configuration determines perception.
Though Helmholtz was more about inference, Gestalt more about organization.
Broadly, yes. Later, Richard Gregory, a major figure in the 20th century, championed the idea of perception as hypotheses. He saw the brain as actively testing hypotheses about the world based on sensory data and prior knowledge, very much in a Helmholtzian and Proto-Bayesian vein. He argued illusions are valuable because they demonstrate this hypothesis testing process, often revealing the assumptions the brain makes. He famously defined illusions as systematic discrepancies from truth. This contrasted with James Gibson's direct realism, which downplayed the role of internal processing.
Perception as hypotheses. That also links back to the predictive brain idea.
Absolutely. There's a strong recurring theme throughout the history of illusion research. Perception isn't passive reception. It's an active process of inference, organization, and sense-making, especially when faced with incomplete or ambiguous information. Illusions perfectly highlight this constructive nature.
From ancient art to modern theories. So where is illusion research heading now? What are the current frontiers and maybe the big unanswered questions?
It's still a very vibrant field, leveraging modern tools. One major frontier is the neuroscience of illusions. Researchers are using techniques like fMRI, EEG, TMS, and even single-cell recordings in animals to pinpoint the brain mechanisms and neural correlates underlying specific illusions.
What are they finding?
It's challenging because you need to disentangle the illusion itself from general factors like attention. But studies are linking specific brain areas or processes to illusions. For example, activity in the superior colliculus seems related to the auditory-driven visual continuity illusion. The V2 area of the visual cortex might modulate V1 activity during neon color spreading illusions. Pupil dilation has been shown to track subjective brightness in illusions. Researchers are mapping out the neural circuits involved in things like the rubber hand illusion or the brain activity patterns associated with perceptual switches in ambiguous figures like the Necker cube.
So, mapping the illusion directly onto brain activity. What about computers and AI?
That's another big area, computational modeling and AI. Researchers build computational models, often inspired by the visual cortex, to see if they can simulate illusion perception. Some models focusing on low-level filtering can explain certain lightness illusions. There's also a lot of interest in testing current AI systems, especially deep neural networks used in computer vision, to see if they are susceptible to the same illusions humans are.
Is AI susceptible?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and often for different reasons than humans. This comparison helps us understand both human perception and the limitations of current AI. There's also this intriguing concept of illusion illusions.
Illusion illusions? What's that?
These are stimuli designed to look like they should cause an illusion, example, having the structure of a Muller-Lyer figure, but are actually physically veridical. The lines are different lengths. Humans perceive them correctly, but sometimes AI systems get fooled, perhaps suggesting the AI relies on superficial pattern matching rather than deeper human-like perceptual understanding or reasoning. It's a way to probe the capabilities of AI perception.
Using illusions to test if AI sees like us. Clever. Are there still big debates in the field?
Oh, absolutely. One is whether we can find an overarching theory that explains all illusions. Given their diversity, optical, sensory, perceptual, cross-modal, that seems unlikely. Are illusions best seen as systematic errors or just the normal operation of perceptual mechanisms encountering atypical stimuli? There's even philosophical debate about whether calling them discrepancies from truth is the right framing.
Right. What else?
The role of individual differences is still actively researched. We know susceptibility varies, but is there a general factor for illusion sensitivity? Some studies find weak correlations between different visual illusions, suggesting very specific mechanisms. Other recent work proposed a general factor I linked perhaps to personality, but results are mixed. Methodological challenges remain in studying these differences reliably. It's kind of analogous to the debate about general intelligence versus domain-specific cognitive abilities.
So how much these differences are linked is still up for grabs.
Exactly. And fundamentally, the study of illusions continues to grapple with the core questions about the nature of perception itself. How does the brain transform raw sensory input into coherent object representations and conscious percepts? What are the precise roles of feed-forward and feedback processing? The debate about innate biases versus learned experience, like the cultural byproduct hypothesis for Muller-Lyer, also continues.
So despite all we know, illusions aren't fully solved mysteries.
Not by a long shot, they remain critical tools and fascinating puzzles that keep pushing our understanding of the mind and brain.
This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. It's really amazing, almost humbling to realize how these sensory illusions reveal the truly active, constructive nature of our perception.
It really is, isn't it? These misinterpretations, these errors, they aren't flaws. They're systematic windows into how our brains build our reality using rules, assumptions, shortcuts honed by evolution and experience.
And they teach us so much about normal perception, cognitive biases, clinical conditions, and they even find their way into art and technology.
Exactly. It challenges that simple idea that we just passively receive reality. It highlights the brain as this incredible active model builder. There are deep philosophical implications there too, about knowledge, subjectivity, consciousness.
Right. It really makes you question how much of what we perceive day to day is a direct reflection of the world, and how much is the brain's best guess or interpretation.
Precisely. And seeing how illusion research has evolved and where it's going with neuroscience and AI just shows how much more there is to uncover.
So maybe one final provocative thought for our listeners to take away.
Maybe just this. Take a moment sometime today and consider how many of your own everyday perceptions might be subtle constructions, elegant interpretations woven by your brain. Understanding illusions isn't just about spotting tricks. It offers this incredible glimpse into the very nature of your own subjective experience, the active role your mind plays in shaping the world you inhabit. Maybe seek out some illusions online, play with them, and just ponder that amazing constructive process happening constantly within your head.